What's up, peeps? This is Robbie Ray Rana with Radio Free Kyrat, broadcasting from an undisclosed location here in the beautiful country of Kyrat. Now, due to the recent political administration of one Pagan Min, this broadcast was temporarily banned and unable to air. But now we're back in action, thanks to my boy Ajay Ghale, so let's get started. Going back to the typical format, we're going to cover three main topics. Those are going to be today the 2016 election in the United States. Then we're going to talk about electoral reforms in the United States, what we can do to make elections in the United States better. And finally, we're going to talk about the Labour leadership election occurring right now within the United Kingdom. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. Let's talk about the 2016 election. So wow, we see a very different dynamic going on the Republican and the Democratic side in terms of the primaries coming up. On the Democratic side, you basically have two major candidates, Hillary Clinton, who is the former Secretary of State, and Senator Bernie Sanders. Hillary is presumed to win the nomination. She's considered the favored candidate. Bernie Sanders is holding on in there and is actually getting a good amount of support from young voters, college students, and the like, and the more progressive base of the party is rallying around him. So it's basically a contest between those two. Of course, there are people like Governor Martin O'Malley in the mix as well, but for the most part, I'd imagine that the candidate on the Democratic side is going to be either Sanders or Clinton. However, on the Republican side, we see a completely different dynamic. People are basically announcing their candidacy every day, and we've got over 17 candidates, major candidates, running for office. We just recently saw one of the recent debates with sort of a happy hour at the beginning, featuring around 7 candidates, and then the actual debate featuring the top polling 10 candidates. So I'm just going to give my quick thoughts on the candidates and then who I'm supporting for the election and why. So on the Republican side, no one really stands out to me. You know, years back, not that I am a Republican, but I did enjoy John Huntsman's run. He represented to me what it really is to be a moderate Republican. But unfortunately, he was too moderate for the party and didn't get the nomination. I mean, I guess they call John Kasich, who's a governor of Ohio, the compassionate conservative. I don't know how compassionate he really is. I looked up his positions. I guess relatively speaking. Of course, there's Donald Trump. You know, honestly, I don't want to give him more airtime than he needs. I just find his candidacy a joke, and I find him a very ignorant individual. So I'm just going to leave it at that and move on from there. Of course, Carly Fiorina, sorry, I mispronounced that. Carly Fiorina is gaining a lot of attention in the press. She did a very good job at the debate. I know some friends of mine really like her. I think she has a good chance of pulling well, but I don't think she's going to do well against establishment candidates like Bush. And then you also have people like Rand Paul and Marco Rubio who are sort of doing their own thing. And Chris Christie recently put his hat in the ring. Honestly, I don't know what's going to happen at this point, but I will tell you, if the nominees end up being Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush, I will be sorely disappointed and likely be voting for a third-party candidate that isn't Donald Trump. So, who am I supporting for the 2016 election? Well, it's no surprise if you know anything about my political background in the country of Kyrat that I'm going to be supporting Bernie Sanders to be president in 2016. He's a very progressive individual. He's someone who I believe with on most issues. He's the candidate I most closely align with. So it's that reason that I'm giving my official endorsement. So Radio Free Kyrat is officially endorsing Bernie Sanders for the 2016 election. Of course, he has to get the primary first, which is, of course, a tough battle. Now, a lot of my friends on the more Democratic side have mentioned that Hillary is very liberal. She's just as liberal as Sanders. She just doesn't show it as much. I agree that she's liberal on many positions, things like abortion, social issues, things like that. But the problem is she's not going to be liberal on the one issue that matters to me the most, and that's getting money out of politics. And the reason that issue matters to me the most is, for me, it's the a priori issue. You can't really solve all the other issues unless you solve this one first. And if we want to get our economy back on track, that means holding big banks accountable and actually making the real hard decisions that have to be made about, actually saying, no, we're not going to let the rich and the 1% control the entire economy. I'm not against the rich. I'm not against job creation. But the idea that these wealth management firms and these large banks are like the godsend from America, that idea needs to basically get destroyed. And I think Bernie Sanders is going to do that. And you can tell by looking at the political payrolls. It doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican. You look at the people you look at who is funding the candidates. You look at Hillary Clinton, she's getting a lot of money from the big banks, places like Goldman Sachs and Citigroup, and to be fair, the same can be said of many Republican candidates. However, Bernie Sanders, look at where his funding is coming from. It's coming from places like unions, it's coming from individuals. He's a man about the people, and even if you don't agree with him on most political issues, he's the only person up there who really has integrity, who really is going to fight for what he believes in and isn't going to be bought out. And you have to respect that, whatever sort of political dynamic you're coming from. So recently, there was an incident that occurred in the Seattle area where the Black Lives Matter movement interrupted one of his rallies, I guess you could say. And so there was a lot of anger on both sides. Honestly, I think at the end of the day, Bernie maybe should have allowed them to speak, but at the end of the day, he did put out recently, if you go on his website, his positions on racial injustice, which cover not just hate violence and hate crimes, but the whole idea of institutional racism, institutional violence, rooted in history and the institutions we have in the government and changing that. And I think he is going to be progressive on these issues. Sure, I would like to say he would be a little bit more outspoken, but these people also didn't interrupt a rally a lot of people came to go to, but admittedly they did show the problems with sort of this idea of just supporting Bernie for the sake of supporting Bernie and not actually addressing the real issues and sort of this passive acceptance of Black Lives Matter as opposed to taking any real action. The Black Lives Matter protests did actually highlight that well, and hopefully I think there is going to be reconciliation there. I think Bernie Sanders has either probably privately already talked to them in some capacity, and I have no doubt that he's going to be the best candidate moving forward in the future. And believe me, even if he may have stumbled a little bit there, and by stumble I mean not really, because all he did was just the fundraiser was, not the fundraiser, the rally was canceled. But I think that's something he can work on. Believe me, he's going to be better on race relations than most of the Republican candidates. And I don't know about Hillary Clinton. I guess we'll just have to find out. Also, keep in mind that the views broadcasted on Radio Free Kyrat are only indicative of my own personal views and are not endorsed by any of my employers or anything of my friends or anything such as that. Also, keep in mind that this is all just my own personal opinion. Do not construe my opinions to be facts, even if the opinions themselves are based off of facts and logical analysis. So, that being said, that covers the 2016 election. Obviously, still a whiles away, so I don't want to talk too much about it, but those are my general thoughts there. Bernie Sanders is going to hold people accountable. We're going to move forward as a nation. There's some economics that I want to talk about in a future podcast. So I know some people have criticized his economic views, and it's time for me to defend Keynesianism again because I am a proud Keynesian. We'll talk about that in a future podcast. So, the second thing we're going to talk about is electoral reforms in the United States. So, rather than just give my opinion on the election, we're going to talk about how do we make this country better. So, let's talk about the election process itself in the United States. Now, in the link below, I have attached an article written by my good friend Devin Mitchell, who wrote many good suggestions for how we should make elections in the United States and the primary process better. I'm going to talk about many of the things he suggests, and believe me, he'll be the first one to admit he's not the first person to write about this. Many people have talked about this in the past. I've talked about this a lot in my college classes back in the day. But here in Kyrat, we do need some help with our electoral reforms. So let's talk about some of the solutions we can do. First, let's talk about how the primaries ought to work. So with primaries, I think there should be a vote all at once. Rather than having, Iowa, New Hampshire go first, sure, it's historic, but it's historic just for the sake of being historic. The problem is it creates logistical inefficiencies, but not to mention it could influence how certain voters act. So if they see a candidate doing well, even if that's not their favorite candidate, they might change their vote accordingly. Or it could be a situation where because someone didn't do enough in the first few states, they're knocked out, even though a majority of the country may have liked this individual. Because the states that went first did not like this individual, they no longer have the ability to compete at the ballot box. So that being said, I think it's a good idea that we should vote out all at once. And this may sound crazy, but think about it. There's already things like Super Tuesday where a bunch of states go all at once. Why don't we make it all 50 states at the same time? Another thing we could do is bring the voting back to the power of the people. Right now, when you vote in the primaries, you're not voting for the actual candidate. You're voting for essentially a delegate that goes to the convention. And usually the delegates go along with the voters, but we do have seen discrepancies in the past. Now, in the 50s, 60s, and before the essentially McGovern reforms that happened in the Democratic Party in the LBJ era, before that, these party bosses pretty much controlled everything. Where there were situations where there was huge popular support for certain candidates, and that didn't matter. It was just the party bosses that controlled everything. And you still see a lot of that. So, for example, Hillary Clinton had more popular support in terms of the vote count in 2008, but Barack Obama ended up being the nominee. So we should give the power back to the people and have it be a direct election where they vote for the individual themselves. Sure, conventions are fancy, but they should only be for show, and they definitely should not be the ones that are deciding who gets to run our nation. That should be left to the people if we truly claim to be a democratic republic. Another thing we can do, and not just primaries, but in general elections as well, is ranked choice voting. I have been a big advocate of this. Honestly, I've never met a single individual, Republican, Democrat, and, well, maybe not anarchist, because you probably don't believe in voting most of the time, but it's depending on what sort of anarchist and political systems you are. But basically, any political person I've met has agreed with ranked choice voting. I've never met someone who's like, yes, the current system is perfect, when ranked choice voting is BS. No, I've never met anyone like that. So what is ranked choice voting? It's literally just that. It's also known as instant runoff voting and preferential voting. But essentially, you rank candidates 1, 2, 3 instead of just voting for a single individual candidate. What this allows Americans to do is finally vote for the candidate that they actually want to vote for. Because in the past, you would have these situations where you might be a supporter of a third party in the United States, but you know they won't win. So you're forced to strategically vote for the Democrat or Republican nominee, even though you know that your actual candidate that you enjoy will never make it. This allows you to, put the check number 1 next to the candidate you like the most, even if they're a third party. And if that doesn't work through, you're not wasting a vote because you also have listed down your second and third preference. So the way it normally works, and keep in mind there are a few slightly different versions of PR voting, but the main way it works in localities and states that use this sort of voting, this ranked choice voting, is that you basically tally up all the first choice votes. If someone has a majority, great, they win. If someone does not have a majority, then the person with the least amount of first choice votes gets knocked out. And then you look at that candidate's second choice preferences, the people who voted for that individual's second choice preferences. You reallocate those into the system, and so on and so forth until a candidate has a majority of the votes. And so far, people who have implemented it seem to like it. Voters seem to love it because it does offer more choice and freedom. And there really is no big downside. And believe me, the pros definitely benefit the cons. Not that I see many cons with instant runoff voting. So you can read more about this in Devin Mitchell's articles. So shout out to Devin Mitchell. He's been a supporter of Radio Free Kyrat for many years now. I don't know if that's actually true, but this is my broadcast, so I guess I can say that. But shout out to him. And he has a podcast with Mark Lieberman that you guys should check out if you ever get the chance. Though that's more on entertainment and not so much on politics. All right, that being said, I feel like I'm rambling a bit. Also, just a side note before we get to the final topic, I sometimes say my V's sort of weird, so voting, that sounds a little different. It's because my V's sometimes sound like W's. No big deal there, just a heads up if you're wondering why does it sound strange. So now let's talk a little bit about British politics. That's why I had the intro there in the beginning, and I give some of my commentary at the end for fair use value. So let's talk about the Labour leadership election in the United Kingdom. So just a little bit of a background for those who might not know a lot about British politics. In Britain, there are various parties like that in the United States. There's the Labour Party, which is more left or center-left. You could call them very similar to the Democratic Party in the United States. There's the Conservative Party, who are colloquially known as the Tories. These are more of the center-right candidates. You can call them like the Republicans. But there's also several substantial third-party candidates that do end up getting a few seats in Parliament. These include the Green Party, UKIP. UKIP is a recent party. They don't have any seats, but they basically were a far right-wing party centered on basically like very nationalistic and things like that. Make Britain great again. There's also the Scottish National Party, which took a lot of seats from Labour this year. Their ideologies are very similar to Labour, but they're also focused on Scottish nationalism, hence the Scottish National Party, or SNP for short. So the SNP took a lot of seats. They did very successful in the Scottish areas. That shouldn't be a surprise. And then there's also the Lib Dems, or Liberal Democratic Party. They're sort of the centrist party. In the previous administration, they formed a majority. Parties can form coalitions in order to get a majority in Parliament, because you need a majority in Parliament to rule. So they formed a majority. The Liberal Democrats formed a majority with the Conservatives to basically, control the United Kingdom. Then there was an election in 2015. Many people and many polls had the election as neck and neck between Labour and Conservative. To everyone's surprise, Labour won a clear majority, and everyone was sort of shocked. And what happened is not only did Labour lose a few seats, but basically the SNP took over a lot of Labour's previous seats. So in traditional British fashion, and this doesn't happen in the United States, so it's understandable if you didn't know this, if your party loses the election and you're head of the party, you're done. You're gonzo. A lot of leaders of the party will just simply resign right after the election. So in this case, Ed Miliband was the leader of Labour. He resigned. Nick Clegg was the leader of the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats got crushed in this election, didn't get many seats at all. They lost a bunch of seats. So Nick Clegg resigned. And I think some of the other minor parties, their heads resigned, though that wasn't as big of an issue. So that triggered, as you can imagine, a contest within the Labour Party to determine who's going to run the Labour Party. And essentially, whoever it does end up becoming this opposition leader will become prime minister if they are elected in the next election, essentially. So it's a primary of sorts, though the system works differently. I would have to go into more detail to explain that a little bit more. But just think of this as the equivalent of the Democratic primary, except it's happening in the United Kingdom. So there's 4 major candidates running: Jeremy Corbyn, Yvette Cooper, Andy Burnham, and Liz Kendall. I'm going to give a brief background on each of them and who I'm supporting and why, and the situation in the United Kingdom. Keep in mind, I did write an article about this. You can find this also on my blog. I also have included a link below of who I'm supporting and why. But it's been a very hotly contested race. Basically, you have Jeremy Corbyn. He is the dark horse candidate. Not many people thought he'd be successful, but he's right now pulling the best. He's probably the most left of all the candidates, firmly believes in nationalizing certain industries in the UK, including the energy sector, very anti-war. He has won awards for like social justice and things of that nature, and so on and so forth. Many people, not necessarily in the Labour Party, some in the Labour Party find him way too left. Like Tony Blair, who is the former Prime Minister of the UK, definitely does not want Corbyn to win and feel that he will just cause Labour to lose in the future. So you got that going on. You got Yvette Cooper. She doesn't necessarily, she's not outspoken as Corbyn, but she's generally towards the left. She shares many of the positions. A big focus of her campaign has been about equality in terms of disabled individuals, the LGBTQA community, women, and things like that, which is easily respectable. I honestly think she's probably very similar to Corbyn, but in her political beliefs, but she's definitely not as outspoken. You have Andy Burnham, who I call the stereotypical Labor candidate. This is like just the stereotypical Labor, like fancy politician, the next Tony Blair, Ed Miliband. He's getting a lot of support from basically the mainstream. He's the establishment candidate. He is the establishment candidate. And then you got Liz Kendall, who's also getting a lot of buzz. She represents a more center-right sort of policies. She's probably the most right-leaning of the four candidates, and she's gotten some support as well. Now, it's not surprising, given that I supported Bernie Sanders, that I'm all for Jeremy Corbyn. He is gay. There's a reason there's all this popular support around him. It's because people are tired of the just BS British politics that very much functions like the US politics, just bought out by the big donors. And people are just like wondering where the heart and soul of Labour is. And I think it's all about the working class, which is literally how Labour came into fruition. It's called the Labour Party because it was formed literally within Labour unions. I also would be completely okay if Yvette Cooper won. I would also be ecstatic. I can live with Andy Burnham, but I am just tired of seeing the establishment. It's time for an actual change and for Labour to actually have some guts and gusto and actually have the strength and courage to fight the Tories and not be afraid to have their own political positions. This is why I just can't support Liz Kendall in good conscience. It's because if you try to fight the Tories at their own game and try peddling towards the left, you're not going to win that game. The Tories are better at that game than you are. But if you appeal to the youth, if you appeal to every working class individual in Britain, which I assure you outweighs the number of people that the Tories will end up getting if Labour decides to actually get some strength and stand up to the man and not just sit there lying there in self-pity, then that's how you're going to get a strong party. That's how people are going to rally around Labour. That's how you're actually going to get a movement going. You think Ajay Ghale just climbed the ladder of success with his hands in his pocket? No, he successfully took over Kyrat by some strength and courage, and he's just like, screw it, I'm going to do the right thing. And that's exactly what Labour needs to do right now, is to be Ajay Ghale, to support Jeremy Corbyn or Yvette Cooper, and to rally around this candidate. Right now everyone's beating themselves up. The Conservatives are very happy because, one, Labour's beating themselves up. Two, they think if Jeremy Corbyn wins, it's just going to be an easy win for them because they can just paint him as a left-wing radical. Well, I have a big news for you, Tories. If Jeremy Corbyn wins, he's actually going to have a lot of anger towards you guys. He's going to fight back, and he's not going to take it. And that means you're actually going to get a Labour that people are like, oh, these guys are actually fierce as... And then they're going to start fighting, and then it's going to be great. Because Labour is going to have strength, and they're going to get back those seats. And I don't see Jeremy Corbyn afraid of working with SNP, whereas Ed Miliband said nope, even though I'm pretty sure he was secretly open to it. And that's why Ed Miliband wasn't as successful. He wasn't a fighter. He was strong, but he wasn't willing to he was afraid to be Labour at its roots, and Labour can't be afraid to be itself. So that being said, that concludes my podcast for Radio Free Kyrat. It's been a long time, I know. It's been a while. But thanks to Ajay Ghale, we've been able to take down some of the radio towers and get this broadcast running. So hopefully you are able to listen to this. My fellow individuals of Kyrat. Thanks for your support. If there's any political topic that you want me to discuss, just let me know and I'll go over it in the next podcast. And if you would like to come on to this podcast itself or call in and you live in Kyrat, just let me know. I'm always looking to have new guests and to start some good debates, whether you agree with me or not. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for listening in. It's good to be back. What's up, peeps? This is just some brief commentary on the band The Sex Pistols, given that I played one of their songs, Anarchy the UK, in the beginning, so this is basically for fair use value. But I do enjoy this band thoroughly, so I'll probably review them more in depth in the future video. But basically, the band was formed in the 1970s. They came out with the album Nevermind the Bollocks in 1977, basically paved the way for punk rock since then. The band consisted of John Lydon, sometimes known as Johnny Rotten, Steve Jones, Sid Vicious, Glenn Matlock, and Paul Cook. All very influential and famous in their own ways. The band caused a lot of uproar because a lot of Brits did not like their music. Um, they were very anti-monarchy, anti-establishment, and sort of led the foundation for the punk scene. But that's why the band and the album are so influential, even though they sort of died out after a few years. They've had a few reunions here and there, but basically they lived and died in the 70s. But I really like the lead singer, John Lydon. If you ever see some of his interviews, especially his recent ones, he's just so honest about everything. And he's one of the most plain spoken, down to earth people I've seen in terms of the music industry. And he's just a straight shooter. Overall, the band and the music is thoroughly enjoyable. Definitely has that punk feel to it, and it's just good music overall. So, pretty good ratings there. That being said, you should definitely take a chance to listen to them, and I'll probably do a more in-depth review in the future. So that being said, thanks for listening.